Welcome to the first session of the Geographers that Ate Themselves by Carl Olsson. This seminar will examine the idea of losing oneself to space. Taking a cue from Roger Caillois' speculations about a deep-rooted temptation of all beings to recede into a generic background, we will examine the allure that the environment poses for thought. The corollary of Caillois' speculation is that space is a problem to manage, not only for humans, but for animal life as such. The universal will of slipping back into the external world, of being assimilated into space, supposes a primordial separation from the environment that makes space intentionally manageable. Recent works in the philosophy of biology have found the vocabulary to talk about such management of space through a concept of autonomy that synthesizes spatial logics by way of physiological barriers, internalizations of vital functions, and capacities for self-directed locomotion. Putting Caillois' embryonic theory to work, we will now consider how the problem of space extends into the history of science and highlights the innate vulnerabilities of the Enlightenment project. With the help of neglected episodes from the history of geographical thought, a discipline whose duty is to cognitively manage space, we can recast the dialectic of the Enlightenment alongside other biological failures to keep the external world at bay. Carl Olsson is a writer and theorist working with histories and philosophies of science and spatial theory. His work touches on the human self-image, different concepts of freedom and nature, and transcendental philosophy. Carl recently completed a PhD in human geography at Newcastle University. He contributed to the second cycle of the terraforming at Strelka Institute and has been a visiting scholar at Waseda University. He has written for Urbanomic, Schum, and different geography journals and edited volumes. And now I will pass the mic to Carl.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And hello, everyone. Nice to meet you. The way we're going to run this is that essentially the first session is going to be uploaded to YouTube. So normally I think it would be wise to start with everyone doing kind of a quick round of presentations or introductions. As it is now, we're going to leave that to the end. And I'm essentially going to talk for about an hour, and then we're going to have a small break, and then we will see if there are any questions. And of course, feel free to interrupt me by raising the hand. Yeah, that's basically it. So by way of today's session, then, we're going to kind of begin with a short methodological overview about trying to situate the method of this project of trying to space the dialectic of enlightenment, or to find out this kind of strange parallel line that runs through natural history. And following this overview, we're going to first of all go through the sort of a tension between humanism and naturalism, and the struggle for the human image in essentially post-enlightenment science. And we're going to talk a tiny bit about how this has been noticed by different philosophers throughout the 20th century and become thematized as an issue. And then we're going to actually move on to Roger Caillois' idea about an allure of space, to try to sort of space this entire struggle for the human image. And then if we have time today, depending on how fast I manage to talk, we're going to talk a tiny bit about the concept of autonomy, and to see if we can arrive at the idea or the place of geographical thought to set us up for our next session. If we don't, it's also fine. There we go. Thumbs up if you can see this.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm going to run the presentation like this, so you can also see my cheat notes. So essentially, in terms of the project that we're doing here, it's often said that it's easier to say that things are alike than it is to kind of specify their differences. Like, obviously, it's quite easy to kind of categorize things based on very manifest appearances as the number of legs they have or something like this. It is when it comes to sort of figuring out how things are different that we really run into the challenges. Nevertheless, we're going to kind of make some bold connections and kind of strategically suspend some philosophical nuance to see if we can allow something to come into view. We're going to place things alongside each other that sometimes perhaps would not be placed alongside each other. And we're going to do this to sort of render something visible, and then hopefully we can sort of go back and retroactively see if we can find some nuance in this. If you will allow some more abstraction, we are almost trolling with kind of a giant net that is stitched to capture a certain kind of difference, a certain kind of seemingly structurally similar phenomena in the world. And then we will turn back and look at in much more detail at some moments. Roger Caillois, who Jenny mentioned in the introduction, a French theorist adjacent to the surrealists, and had a name for this. He called it diagonal science, constituted by kind of slightly weird taxonomies, kind of reworked categorizations, almost pseudo analogies, things that sort of seem are almost analogous but not really. Parables, acts of kind of methodologically cutting across different fields and sciences by kind of subsuming things that wouldn't normally be subsumed into the same category, realignment different questions, and sublating things where perhaps normally it wouldn't seem to be the case. Essentially to force differences into communication. Now, of course, there are certain risks by applying this kind of method. One of them, perhaps most predominantly, would be some kind of apophenia, of seeing things that aren't actually connected, but we kind of apply our preconceived patterns and we kind of go astray. Hopefully, we're going to be able to guard against these risks a tiny bit. But I mean, in practice, I mean, a type of anthropomorphism is a very good example of this, sort of seeing faces in electrical sockets and sort of the man in the moon and so on, which of course aren't instances of the human image for real. So to get actually to the topic at hand then, I think sort of course, any serious philosophical project needs to do a little bit of this sort of methodological foreshadowing to sort of set us up to see what we're trying to do. But yeah, to get to the topic at hand, we're going to talk today while trying to anticipate some of the themes that are going to recur in later sessions. I'm going to talk a bit about the conflict between humanism and naturalism in a particular sense that we're going to kind of successively clarify. What does this conflict mean? How has it been understood by other philosophers and thinkers and theorists? And then what can we do with it philosophically? This is, of course, a problematic that has been talked about arguably for a good 400 years at the very least. Is there something left to do? And this is basically our aim for our first meeting today. By way of kind of introduction to this topic, I think I would like to set up and mention something about enlightenment. This is a term that's going to return again and again in a slightly slipshod manner. When I'm talking about enlightenment, I'm talking about a kind of emancipatory project, a kind of an intellectual project. Although of course enlightenment traditionally also encompasses many kind of social attitudes, a sense of freedom in a kind of emancipation in a social sense. I'm going to sort of try to cash this out in terms of ultimately biological autonomy or freedom or emancipation from the, or relative emancipation from the physical environment. There are, of course, social and kind of cultural aspects that we can explore as a part of this, and also in a wider sense, and they will kind of pop up intermittently. But our main focus is essentially going to be almost formal and focused on epistemology. To see the Enlightenment as a kind of epistemological enterprise that is associated with new norms and methods of inquiry in the 17th century. We're going to, and of course, associated with Galileo's Copernican revolution and the mathematization of nature, and perhaps also that are coming out of the Renaissance and that are being in philosophy sort of formalized with and taken up in discourses by people like Descartes and Spinoza on the continent, and Locke and Hume in the UK. In any case, it is sort of to the point being that we're interested in a kind of epistemological matter here, and specifically what are the consequences for how the human being and the human self-image is understood. Of course, I want us to keep in mind, I would kind of suggest this, that we're talking about enlightenment and emancipation here as a kind of a concrete possibility for kind of thought in the human existence. But we're going to, and I'm going to kind of say this, I think it's worth saying that, of course, this is I'm also talking about a concrete historical process, which is essentially the genesis of some sense of modern science in Europe. And inevitably, perhaps as a result of this, we're going to kind of be guilty of a certain kind of Eurocentrism here throughout the seminar. Now, we could kind of course, we can be critical about this kind of delimitation, and I kind of invite that. However, I do think it's interesting to sort of focus on a particular determinate story in order to try to push it to its conclusion and see if we can find some holes in order to actually collapse this entire trajectory in some way. And the best way to do that, I would suggest, is to kind of push it to its limits, or find where the limits are from internal. So this is the sort of our starting point, and we're going to go back and forth a little bit about the sort of the emancipation as an ideal, and the kind of the specificity of a debate that sort of emerges in kind of a European continental tradition. So it is also a philosophical matter, a kind of a question of philosophical reflection on science that I'm going to talk about. And we are indeed interested in the underlying figure of the human being, and particularly as a rational inquirer, someone who is able to pursue knowledge about the world, and in extension, and most importantly, knowledge about itself. Now, as many have argued, but as perhaps Ray Garcia puts in it very well, there is a kind of an unexpected twist in the ideal of a freely inquiring human being, and the image of the human being that this kind of inquirer manages to uncover. There is the name for this twist is essentially the naturalistic self-understanding. The human being in its natural environment, somehow descended from nature, made by nature, is a part of nature, being nature. Nature is suddenly everywhere, even inside. Thought is not really what it would seem to be, but rather a part of an unbroken causal chain. Even when I ask about who I am, certainly I must be some sort of part of nature. Our received view of ourselves is perhaps then not entirely truthful. Am I really kind of free in this way. Note here that what we're asking is not about the ultimate metaphysical status of free will or something like that. What we're asking is about the consequences of an image of the human being as unfree, and what happens when this is either forcefully applied to ourselves or becomes part of a larger cultural movement or tendency, so that we are perfused with images of the human being in the world that goes against who we once thought that we were. The free being that can have rights and is a rational inquirer in some sense, and that is a political animal and has a certain standing and dignity. Perhaps Antonin Artaud puts one of the risks of this in the sort of, or the horror of this in one of the best ways. If we read the following: when you will have made him a body without organs, then you will have delivered him from all his automatic reactions and restored him to his true freedom. Disregarding Deleuze and Guattari's sort of discussion about this section of Artaud's, one of his last works, to have done with the judgment of God, it's interesting to note that sort of finding true freedom from human being is precisely to liberate it from the automatic reactions, from the organs, and from the natural image of the of who he or she is. And we might take this picture from the Canadian children's TV show, Nana Land. Point being here, that the problem is not really that we are sort of automatons or dolls. The problem is essentially that we are not. What I mean, it's sort of the problem really is the mirror image, the image of ourselves that we get from asking about who we are, be it Darwin or sort of on other scales, or kind of in psychology, in behavioral science, and so on. The problem is that the image we get from nature, and not sort of the inherited ideal of us being a kind of a thing with a mind. What I mean by this is that we are not really haunted by the image of a rational doll. We can kind of solve this. We can be a piece of stuff, and we can be a mind. This is not this kind of unproblematic. The real problem is that the image of us as a skeleton or a lump of something without reason. We have to be able to account for the genesis of our thinking and our ability to think, and the kind of the conceptual terms that we use to even ask about who we are. Though, as we will see, this sort of mirror of this sort of disturbing mirror image of ourselves may have a methodological ground. Its products become eventually reflected back to us. In the same way that we look at a sheet of glass with sort of bronze or whatever is behind the mirror, and receive an image. The scaffold leads to something that ends up being perhaps disturbing. And so today we had 3 readings. I think one of the being Arendt's writing about the conquest of space and sort of space flight. And I'm going to just talk about this briefly in order to kind of set up a bit of the area of this kind of problematic. I note that Arendt is talking about, of course, extraterrestrial space and space flight. I'm also going to talk about space a lot, but when I talk about space, I talk about kind of extension. So space in a completely different sense. And hopefully this is going to be particularly confusing. But essentially what Arendt notes here is that there is some kind of ongoing tension between, she calls it humanism and kind of in science, that then lead to all manner of problems that are perhaps cultural in nature, including sort of literal cataclysms in the shape of a nuclear bomb, the rise of technoscience and engineering that sort of populate the world of our everyday being, precisely from the consequences of mathematical sciences and the methods that underlie them. Of course, this is a text that some might call a tiny bit reactionary, and there are sort of certainly echoes here of Heidegger's infamous kind of apoplectic reaction to being asked about the first photos of Earth from space. But I think what's interesting here, I'm going to read this quote briefly, is sort of the tension between different perspectives of the human being as a problematic. So I read, the human brain, which supposedly does our thinking, is as terrestrial, earthbound as any other part of the human body. It was precisely by abstracting from these terrestrial conditions, by appealing to a power of imagination and abstraction that would, as it were, lift the human mind out of the gravitational field of the Earth and look down upon it from some point in the universe. The modern science reached its most glorious and at the same time most baffling achievements. And then later towards the end, she writes, for the conquest of space, the search for a point outside the Earth from which it would be possible to move, to unhinge, as it were, the planet itself, is no accidental result of the modern age's science. So she has here some kind of idea of a determinism that science is going to pursue in a way that alienates the human being from itself. And at stake here is ultimately the dignity, the standing of the human being. I think there is one point that is worth noting, 2 points that are worth noting here. One is sort of, and it's going to become important in a moment, that she seems to tie this to a matter of perspective, looking from different places in the in space is going to kind of yield a different literal view of what the human being is. This is worth keeping in mind. Second, she talks about sort of the medium of this problematic tendency, or sort of the fate of the standing of man, as she calls it, for human being. It's kind of mediated via technology, a kind of a reification of scientific findings. I kind of want to flag here this sort of the pedagogical aspect of enlightenment as a process of, I guess what Kant would say, we call it kind of a process of maturation of the human being. Should be very critical of that. But there is some kind of a pedagogical imperative to instruct about what the world is here and to learn to kind of harness it, that seem to go hand in hand. This is going to be very important for us when we come to the idea of geographical knowledge next week, but also towards the end of the day. Arendt, of course, was not alone to note this. She wasn't the first. Sometimes, I mean, arguably, some of these problems were already kind of implicit in much earlier debates. Husserl would kind of trace it to Descartes, and debates about nihilism in the late 18th century Germany would perhaps also be reflective of sort of this tension. But in any case, I think in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, when these problems are becoming very clear, it is probably Husserl who does the best job of noting them and of discussing them. For him, it really is kind of the mathematization of nature that is the problem. He writes in the Crisis of the European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology, his last work. I think he didn't even complete it. We must sort of, his problem here is really kind of what is the meaning of mathematization of nature, and what is it that the possibility of applying ideal mathematical structure to the experiential field, what are kind of the conditions of possibility and what are the consequences of doing this? So we must note something of the highest importance that occurred even as early as Galileo: the surreptitious substitution of the mathematically substructed world of idealities for the only real world, the one that is actually given through perception, that is ever experienced and experienceable, our everyday life world. This substitution was promptly passed on to successors, the physicists of all the succeeding centuries. So here, essentially, there is a conflation, or a tendency toward confusion between the world in which the physicist lives and goes about his or her everyday business, and the world that sort of is produced as a result of their repertoire of methods, and specifically mathematical methods. And what Husserl is trying to do, he's trying to sort of inquire, and ultimately he thinks this is going to lead to kind of a crisis in science itself, kind of a self-undermining process. So he's essentially asking back into the ultimate ground. What is it actually, in order to cultivate an awareness of what is it actually that makes the scientific process possible to begin with at all? Sorry. Well, cheers to that. In any case, let me just orient myself for 1 second. Yes, I think we can move on to sort of, so then he asks in the same text much later, the world interpreted as rational were affected, but also everyday world consciousness and world life, the pre-scientific world in the everyday sense, the world within whose obvious validity of being, the activities and dealings of men untouched by science take place. The world, which is ultimately also that of the scientist, and not merely when he returns to everyday praxis. And then he will also kind of address that this same sort of almost arid conception of the world as is produced by the sciences, sort of ungrounds itself and unhinges its own foundations, is also kind of taken up in the transcendental philosophical project that sort of culminates with Kant's kind of reaches its high point at Kant, perhaps, and he's going to be critical of this. And we have to return to some sort of everyday philosophical, everyday ground of experience, our life world, in order to actually find the root meaning and analyze almost the form of our experience, in order to have and sort of bake this into the scientific project, in order to maintain its validity and its ultimate ground. So we have Arendt and Husserl, who seem to be on kind of similar tracks. Of course, Husserl is writing this some 30 years earlier than Arendt, who gives the speech or sort of the presentation that we read, that I talked about earlier in, I think, 1968 or something like this. Around the same time as that, there is in the US, there is Wilfrid Sellars, who construes the problem in a slightly different way, as a tension between, or a conflict between, manifest and scientific images of man in the world, the human being in the world of this. For Sellars, compared to, at least to Arendt, we're dealing with something that is more to do with the conceptual dependency of scientific inquiry on the concept of a person as someone who is acting according to reasons rather than merely to causes. And it seems here that, and I think sort of between these different projects, I'm going to flag this, is that there is a sense not only in that naturalism kind of, this kind of the naturalistic self-understanding interferes with who we think that we are, but precisely there is, to put it very clearly, that it's precisely when the naturalistic self-understanding enters into the image of the human being as a describer that we face some kind of severe contradiction, because if the result of sort of painting a picture of yourself in a way is that you no longer can be a painter, because you sort of the self-portrait that you see is sort of so strange that you kind of confuse yourself with it, you have kind of a problem. You're ungrounding yourself through your activity. It's as if sort of there is a continuous struggle between two tendencies in the Enlightenment, and this is the conflict between humanism and naturalism, to always one-up one another. That the ground is either ultimately humanistic or ultimately kind of naturalistic, in the sense that the humanist will say, oh, but whatever you're doing, it depends on your status as a person or on your kind of your life world. Whereas you go to a biologist or a psychologist, and they're going to say, no, but what you're doing but that in turn depends on your the synapses that fire in your brain, or sort of or whatever kind of scale construct you want to kind of arrange this in, and on it goes. Because of course, to that the humanists, as Arendt would have said, would try to say the same thing over and over again. There is kind of an ongoing kind of regress, a sort of an unstable position that seems to be at the heart of what we are going to call the kind of the crisis here, following Husserl. Now, what is particularly interesting about Sellars' distinction between manifest and scientific images is that it is essentially kind of conceptually articulated. It certainly doesn't have very much to do, despite the kind of the name of an image, it's more of a conceptual framework that not only is are there more than one, but this, what he calls the manifest image, being sort of our everyday view of ourselves as persons that that act according to process. I go to the supermarket to buy apples because I like to eat apples, and I can kind of justify that if someone asks. But the scientific image is itself kind of multiple. It's kind of we're dealing with a kind of a veritable cascade of different ways of representing the human being in different disciplines, from biology to psychology to physics to what have you, chemistry. This is also something we should just keep in mind. Of course, there are those who have kind of tried to embrace the sort of the crisis by sort of trying to eliminate our everyday view of ourselves. There's Thomas Metzinger who argued that we are ourselves are essentially transparent models that we don't really see. But ultimately, we can kind of cultivate an awareness that can push ourselves in a direction that we're paying more and more attention to ourselves as essentially neurophysiological processes. There are Patricia and Paul Churchland who argue that basically our everyday way of talking about ourselves, the manifest image, is, they call it folk psychology, is essentially a theory of what a human being is, but it's not only the theory, but it's also a false theory that we could eventually kind of just get rid of and replace it with something that is more accurate. I kind of want to mention these things. Of course, what arises at this point is a very interesting question about, okay, so if you change your concept radically of what a human being is, do you actually change also, well, what a human being is? And there seem to be, presumably there would be some sort of consequence, not only sort of to who you think you are, but actually in some sort of in nature, if we put it this way, to what you are by sort of radically changing your conception of yourself. We're kind of going to see some of this a little bit as we proceed. I also want to, though sort of many of what I've been talking about classically, this has been construed on sort of in relationship to physics and chemistry and behavioral sciences, psychology. I think it's interesting also that it occurs at different scales. I want to mention this before we move on to sort of the more overarching philosophical point. For instance, Bruno Latour and Tim Lenton talk about this conflict in a way in relationship to to Gaia theory, and it's been kind of there also in debates around the Anthropocene, the idea that sort of we are in a new geological age that is dominated by human as a kind of a causal force, which precisely requires seeing yourself as a causal force. So the specter of naturalization is sure to trigger in social scientists and those in the humanities a recoil of horror, rightly so. It's enough to remember social Darwinism, sociobiology, dialectic materialism, eugenics, the intelligence quotient controversies, or for that matter, much of economic science that purports to make human societies obey the laws of nature. Against those attempts at ordering and regulating humans in the name of nature's iron cage, the domain of human freedom should be protected at all costs. Their problem being that sort of at the same time, sort of limiting human freedom in this way is precisely what is required for some sort of cogent, coherent environmental action. So there is sort of a great paradox that ultimately falls back into the human self-image. Okay. So if you go back to Arendt, she talked about essentially different perspectives, different ways of seeing the human being. I am going to argue now that all these questions about the human self-image, which is not only about this human self-image, but precisely about the question of the human within its environment, the human in the world. I'm going to argue that this is an essentially spatial problem, but we need to be a little bit careful about how we construe it as a spatial problem. There are, of course, different problems in what we have been talking about. There's the question of dignity of the human being, the questions of free choice. There's sort of the sort of socio-political and ethical questions that Latour and Lenton highlighted about that ultimately kind of result in sort of in true horrors if they are unaddressed. But I think at sort of the most, in a sense, most basally, philosophically, there's the question that appears certainly both in Husserl and in Sellars, the question of the intelligibility of thinking itself. How do we ground our possibility for asking about who we are? And I think there are even two ways of understand the conflict as a whole. One of them would be perspectival in the sense of looking at literally different views of the human in the world. Whereas the other one, ever so tentatively, I'm going to call it semantic, which has to do with kind of the intelligibility, kind of conceptual intelligibility. What are the types of concepts that you're using in order to ask about yourself? The concept of the person, for instance, seems to be very crucial in Sellars. His entire problem being sort of how can we map the two different images, the two types of images, the scientific image and the manifest image, onto one another, so as to not end up with manifest kind of contradiction. After all, many of the people that are writing about the problems that I have talked about so far are explicitly interested in some sort of solution, whether it is through kind of removing either the sort of the humanistic or the naturalistic image of the human being, or most commonly and perhaps most productively, to find some kind of synthesis or fusion, to find ways to map them onto one another so as to be less, we end up in a less alienating situation. But how would a kind of a semantic construal of this conflict, one that has to do with the meaning of the human being in the world, be spatial? How would that be kind of a spatial problem? Well, there are a few ways we can answer that question. And we're going to approach it through a kind of matter of asking backwards and sort of asking about the grounds. And so sort of to recap once again what I just said, essentially, or sort of some of the themes I've been talking about. There seem to be different ways of kind of rooting the problem, and to sort of what do we do with this conflict, and sort of how is a solution to be pursued. Which is not, this is not to say that any of these are kind of, they are mutually exclusive, but certainly there are different kind of alternative routes one can pursue. And one sort of direction goes towards kind of an analysis of what it means to essentially to live in the world in our everyday attitude, which is what Husserl, perhaps probably someone like Heidegger also attempts. Others have been asking about really the natural history of thinking. Rouse and Strelny, and sort of course, we could group in sort of ideas that sort of really try to portray the human being as a natural thing here, too, as a kind of a system of our thought is neurophysiological, kind of enacted in relationship to the environment and so on. But another direction, seemingly unexplored, seeks to write a natural history to naturalize the contradiction as such and the determinate failure it results in. In other words, not only to trace the genesis of human thinking in nature, but to trace precisely the failure that the conflict between, or the crisis that the conflict between humanism and naturalism apparently result in. What sort of thing is this crisis? Surely, the good naturalist will say, a moment in history in its own right, a moment in natural history, a failure of the unilateral differentiation of the animal from its environment, from the organism, the human organism from its environment. Indeed, the entire tension between humanism and naturalism, or subjectivism and objectivism, as some would call it perhaps, deserves to be given its own place in the natural order. The play between the successful and the unsuccessful grounding of science can itself be described in nature of sorts. And this is indeed the sort of the bold move that we are in a way going to pursue in this seminar. And we're going to do it precisely by finding out how the problem itself is spatial. So this is our method and our kind of project here. I'm going to talk for a few more minutes, and then we're going to kind of take a small break. Let me ask though, are there any sort of questions so far? Does this sound familiar, entirely new, or doesn't make any sense at all to you? I just want to kind of gauge the room a tiny bit. Niam, please.
I think it's just a little clarification. I think I I'm not sure if I grasped just the last thing you said about the the naturalistic, the naturalizing tendency or approach as a failure of unilateral, putting it down to a failure of unilateral differentiation. Can you just go back to that point there, because that just seems really interesting and important.
Absolutely. This is, I think, me getting a little bit ahead of myself here. Essentially, what I have in mind, if we think of kind of enlightenment in the sense that we've been talking about it, is this as a project of emancipation in a sense. The question arises: an emancipation from what? Freedom from what? And what we're going to sort of reach at the end of today's session, or perhaps at the beginning of next one, is that this is perhaps ultimately a question of freedom from the environment, and freedom from the sort of the physical environment surrounding the organism. So perhaps one way to kind of heuristically make sense of this is good to kind of think about the difference between what's called culture and nature as really a kind of unilateral distinction, in the sense that culture is something that is, of course, in one sense part of the natural world, in the same sense as everything else. But on the other hand, there seems to be cause to kind of find some sort of tendency towards separation. And perhaps this is also true for any kind of organismal life in a slightly different sense. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. It does. And would you identify that where the kind of collapsing of, I mean, monism is a kind of a collapsing of that, of that difference, and of, as a kind of a critique of anthropocentrism. So would you see that there?
Yeah, I would say so. I think one way also to talk about the sort of the problem of the naturalistic self-understanding is precisely with the kind of the problem of a particular kind of monism that doesn't contain the conceptual resources that we would kind of that we use, that we draw upon to do many of the things that we normally do. The sort of the place for I mean, classically free will or rationality and so on. And this is sort of what ultimately one could argue drives attempts towards pluralism and dualism. The problem with a sort of a pure natural monism, it seems to be lacking certain explanatory resources, and this is perhaps, and the sort of the dawning realization throughout the sort of modernity and the process of enlightenment in this concrete sense, that there seems to be some ground to believe in this kind of monism, but at the same time, we cannot actually commit ourselves to it without sort of having some sort of literally kind of conceptually or kind of meaningful consequences.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of immanentism, a logic of immanence.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
No worries. Does anyone else have any sort of question at this point? Otherwise, I will move onwards towards Caillois to try to sort of set up a connection here, and then it's probably about as far as we're going to today. Okay, I will do this. So another one of the texts we had assigned for today would be Roger Caillois' Mimicry and Legendary Psychasthenia. And essentially, how we're going to use this today is to, I mean, there is a lot going on in this text, but we're going to use it as a way to kind of space the problem, which is to say the tension between humanism and naturalism, to find a kind of a spatial articulation for it that is of the semantic variety rather than the perspectival variety. Because I think in very blunt terms, I think the idea that we're looking at ourselves from strange and new perspectives in the literal sense is not really what's at stake in the problem. It's not really the source of the problem. And then we're going to kind of find a kind of transitional or basal form of the problem in a way of conceptualizing space. Since we may not make it so far, essentially the way we're going to arrive at what we're going to arrive at is that is geography as a form of representing the human being in the environment. So to get into Caillois' mimicry and legendary psychasthenia, I want to draw out essentially a single line that runs through this text. He begins with a kind of a weird theory of mimicry that I think probably most biologists and ethologists would not pay very much attention to. Mimicry is for him a kind of an exuberance and a dangerous luxury. This is interesting. But what's perhaps more interesting is the sense in which there's a sort of something morbid about it, something that is a manner of drawing closer to space and of being say a butterfly that resembles a little, or a larva that resembles a twig or something. Suddenly there's a wrist that is being kind of clipped off by a gardener's shears or something, as though and the animal must restrain its movements perhaps in order to fit into the natural environment which its body has been, as Caillois almost puts it, like sort of photochemically or sort of in a almost visually molded to fit into. There's a kind of a restraining sense to mimicry, even though the ordinary biological explanation for this phenomenon is a kind of an adapted measure. You're not seen by a predator, or if you are a predator, you will be able to kind of sneak up on prey. I will use the term mimicry here, but of course it's what I say will be applicable to other sort of camouflage and sort of systems. In any case, what's interesting about, really interesting about Caillois' article is that so he finds this morbid sense of, or sort of side of mimicry and of similarity, of looking like something else. And then he extends it into psychology, he extends it into culture, but most importantly for our purposes, then he extends it into kind of scientific self-representation. And to sort of to trace this line slowly then, the feeling of personality, he says, considered as the organism's feeling of distinction from the surroundings, of the connection between consciousness and a particular point in space, cannot fail under these conditions to be seriously undermined. As if resemblance and the thinking of resemblance somehow cause a real situation of indistinction, of disappearance. Some of the kind of the sources he uses for specifically his extension into kind of psychology and sort of situations where people represent themselves as being almost eaten by space, replaced by space, come from Janet's kind of concept of psychasthenia, or kind of a psychic weakening, which is sort of, these are quite archaic psychiatric sources. And then there is Eugene Minkowski, who was also a psychiatrist, but was very inspired by Bergson, and he has this some of the quotes that Caillois used. I don't remember if he takes them verbatim from Minkowski or if he sort of paraphrases, but they're basically in a text that's called Lived Time by him. In any case, he has this brilliant phrase, morbid geometrism, as to a kind of, which implies sort of failure to inhabit time properly, and you get stuck on shapes. And he finds this in what at this time would be a patient suffering from schizophrenia. though dubious if this sort of would be a contemporarily valid diagnosis. But in any case, there is this kind of sense, but sorry, excuse me. The real question here, building on these sort of extensions into the psyche, is how does kind of applied geometry, if we remember, just Husserl's kind of the source of essentially the problems that Husserl in particular noticed, but they're also there perhaps in Arendt and Sellars, initiate a kind of something morbid. I'm going to talk about a kind of the maybe somewhat redundantly formulated term topotropism, which is that tropism is sort of a turning in a plant that sort of turns towards the sun, topos being space. So a kind of a spacewardness, a turning towards space. In other words, how does the kind of a focus on space and a thinking of space really create some kind of return to space? Caillois put all of this together and says that all these expressions shed light on a single process, depersonalization by assimilation to space. What mimicry achieves morphologically, in the case of many insects predominantly, magic, psychosis, and forms of representations kind of achieves for human beings. Already here we have some kind of sense of a natural history. And most importantly, Caillois has his own version of what we have talked about so far. It is with represented space that the drama becomes specific, since the living creature, the organism, is no longer the origin of the coordinates, but one point among others. It is dispossessed by its privilege, literally no longer knows where to place itself. One can already recognize the characteristic scientific attitude, and indeed, it is remarkable. Represented spaces are just what is multiplied by contemporary science. Finsler spaces, Fermat spaces, Riemann-Christoffels hyperspace, abstract, generalized, open, and closed spaces, spaces then themselves thinned out, and so on and so forth and so on. The feeling of personality, considered as the organism's feeling of distinction from its surroundings, and the connection between consciousness and a particular point in space, cannot fail, under these conditions, to be seriously undermined. How are we going to understand this? Some might appreciate this. Any responsible adult would say no to these kinds of bizarre things of modern science. I would say that Caillois' construal of the problem here, this sort of disorientation created by essentially modern representations of space, is quite similar to what Arendt is kind of noticing in her construal of the problem, in the sense that sort of it's a question of the place of the human being. Of course, there are differences also, but it's a question of sort of how the human being is seen in its surroundings. In other words, Caillois kind of chooses the perspectival construal of the problem. I think, however, this is kind of implausible, given what he says in the quote above. Because, and if someone is a mathematician here, and they might be able to undermine all of what I'm saying, but I don't think there's anything that is particularly alienating by any kind of non-Euclidean space per se. In other words, by changing the concept of space you have, you might be changing, how you appear, but sort of the conditions of localization in a sense. But there's nothing really that's sort of strange about different representations of space as such. There's also nothing that's really strange about the view of the human being from really far. At the end of the day, we are this is the right one, I think. We are, many animals, us included, kind of routinely use what might be called allocentric representations of space to move around the environment. This is a kind of a projection that uses different points in the environment for localization rather than kind of an egocentric or sort of self-localized reference frame. This is used by all kinds of animals. What is confusing is not really sort of how space is represented or sort of where you find yourself in place. The problem that I think that came across perhaps more clearly in Husserl and in Sellars is some kind of conceptual ungrounding that results from the scientific attitude, if you will. We're dealing with a conceptual problem that has to do more about the conditions under which you perceive yourself in the world, which is already in this kind of phrase, in yourself in the world, is already some kind of implicitly spatial problem. And it is in this sense, as a conceptual, or I call it before, a semantic problem, that I think we should kind of attempt to rewrite what Caillois is doing here. Because essentially, he's writing already a natural history of some kind of disappearance into space, into the surroundings. I'm going to skip this one and simply say that there seems to be in sort of the idea, and if you follow me here, I'm going to kind of, this is the last thing I would say, and then we will move to kind of a small break. But there is something in the idea of a return to space, of losing oneself in the environment, that has the distinctive marks of starting in the middle. Because, as the saying goes, what goes up kind of must also come down. But the corollary, sort of the other side of this, is usually kind of not mentioned. But if we exclude exotic events like sort of the arrival of meteorites on Earth and so on, it is generally true that if an object is going to descend, it must also first have ascended and gone up. And I think what we're going to call the problem of space, which is at the heart of everything I have said so far, it is like this. Because a return to space, and even if it takes the shape of a kind of the scientific attitude, a kind of an ungrounding of the conditions of asking about your own place in the environment, already presupposes some form of achievement, some form of having already emancipated yourself from what is your physical environment. It lives by the kind of taken for granted fact of an extant emancipation from space. So whereas someone like Husserl might be asking about this sort of find a ground for inquiry, the sort of the world that we live in and the experience that is in one sense at the sort of the ultimate basis for asking about where you are. The naturalist construal of this has kind of a one-up in the sense of saying, but where do you come from? Haven't you already kind of set yourself apart from what you are not? And is it perhaps the case that emancipation in this sense, that achieved emancipation, is a question of managing space? And that any representations of space, and specifically of ourselves in the environment, also contribute to this project? A way of really, so that really representing yourself as separate and localizable and so on, is a way of really becoming different from the environment. And that the problem of the crisis, the sort of the naturalistic self-understanding, might be that the conditions of doing that are in some sense twisted or perhaps even imperiled, which raises the question then, and I promise this is the last thing, where the sort of, what is the most fundamental way or place or sort of region of inquiry where this can take place? And I'm gonna leave off there for the time being, and I suggest that we take maybe 10 minutes for a break, and then we return and you can think about if you have any questions or sort of concerns. And then I would like to do a round of presentations, because yeah, it would be nice to sort of to know who you are, and it's also useful to sort of hear your reasoning for being in the seminar, and so on after also you've heard this initial exposition. And I know this is a lot to kind of take in, so how about we reconvene on at 22 past the hour, and we take it from there.
Okay, sounds good.
A few rounds of questions. Okay, so welcome back, everyone, and thank you for your patience in listening to that kind of introduction to an attempt to kind of problematize and draw out what we're going to talk about. We have a question from Nia.
Yeah, hi. There's so many balls in the air here, Carl. It's fantastic. It's wonderful. So I hope my question's not going to be too sort of spread out. Maybe it's not even a question either. I'm just wondering, Descartes comes to mind as a really big actor in this. So in the kind of, representation of self, so there is a, and what you're drawing out, this idea of this image and the autonomy. I'm just wondering what you think about, that he has the adequacy of the representation of the concept. So there's already an ideal, a rationality that there has to be a completeness of representation. And it seems to be that limits are really important in this kind of scientific method, because along with that rationality, there's an idealism, impositing of the complete. But yet at the same time, there's a fear of reduction to the image if it's actually realized. And Canguilhem has a really interesting reading of Descartes, and it is that that for Descartes to differentiate the human, his humanism is, he needs to differentiate the human from the animal, and that he posits the automaton. And I know you said actually that the automaton, I think maybe in the way that you said it in your context, actually, I go along with that. But there's something really kind of interesting here that the automaton plays, because the automaton then for Descartes will have a representation, but completely without consciousness. And that is what allows him to say that the human is differentiated from that as a rational being. But there's a specter of the automaton in the human, because in some sense, there's a possibility of return to that, taken to its limit, especially when you think about, the scientific analytic, and it is actually really about matter in space, and that actually ultimately to its limit, matter is just going to disintegrate into nothing, and it's the void then. So I just kind of wonder there. I've kind of bundled a lot of things in together, but so yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for this reflection. It's quite useful also to sort of have different sort of ways of expressing the sort of the stakes of what we're talking about. I think that Descartes is clearly very sort of fundamental to the entire problem, especially for several reasons. One has to do with the way that he is arguably trying to deal with the problem of sort of how are we going to fit the human being into the world, and famously he resolved this via kind of added his substance dualism, right? But then sort of there are questions about sort of how he manages to achieve this, and what are the sort of the price he pays, and whether it is in some way successful. And there are some I myself would say that there are aspects of Descartes that probably are successful in a way that sort of a dualism is much less pernicious than a kind of a naturalistic monism. The sort of the kind of the, if you will, the semantic threats are lower. It's a kind of a way of solving the problem by kind of a soulful proxy, if you will, by kind of positing a rational soul. But arguably we can sort of then Kant comes along and say that sort of there's a kind of an error here, a kind of he calls the paralogism of a kind of a subruption. And specifically in the third session, we're going to return quite a bit to this in detail. So, and we're going to talk about precisely about what does it actually mean to represent oneself in the external world, and sort of what is going on there. So I think this is also very good comment to kind of look into the future a little bit for us. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thanks.
Do we have any other kind of questions or reflections? I do recognize that there was a lot going on in that, and ultimately, I think what we can kind of have achieved today is to sort of stake out a field of sort of concern that's quite good. I'm going to push the discussion of autonomy and the text by Roslenbroich until next week, and sort of start there. Because I think this is quite, we've gone through quite a lot of stuff already today. Tony, please.
I was just thinking, maybe it would be useful if you would clarify what you mean by naturalism and humanism, because these are very broad.
Yeah.
And you have a very specific reading, but I would like to hear you.
This is indeed a very good point. I think a part of the reason that I haven't clarified it a little bit is that this is kind of the condition of integrating these different perspectives and accounts of some sort of tension that I have sort of been talking about today. So I really wasn't kidding when I said there's a kind of a vagueness and a sort of a fishing with a net with quite large holes. But I think of course, there's also the matter of both of these terms having several meanings and being notoriously pernicious. But by way of kind of giving an attempt, I would say that humanism, in the sense that I'm using it here kind of tentatively, would mean sort of an account of the human as kind of a rational kind of free being, someone that is capable of responding not only to causes but to reasons in this sort of Kantian Sallarsian formulation. I think this is important precisely because many of the sort of the scientific sort of questions that are sort of purportedly scientific questions are going to rely on this. There is going to be someone that is going to ask about where are we going and what am I? And what are the rules of this world that I live in? Whereas naturalism, in this sense, I mean, begins very much as a method, a question of inquiry, of kind of inductive inquiry, but that it also comes along with certain metaphysical commitments to the assumption that the world is only one, and things. Apparently, it seems that there is some kind of causal closure. So how are we going to fit in the image, the kind of the humanistic image of ourselves into this? And of course, the tension emerges in the sort of as we have to sort of navigate between the two. And maybe I will say there is something slightly facetious in what I've been talking about today, because what is most remarkable is maybe not that sort of there's a tension, but how very well we seem to manage to jump between different representations and understandings of who we are in our everyday lives. I mean, it seems to me in some ways quite adept at navigating and suspending the sort of what appears to be a manifest contradiction about what we are. And I think this is worth thinking about, and sort of how is this sort of staved off? Does that help?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
I saw another hand in the air just a moment ago, but that might have been kind of obsolete by what is said. Otherwise, please go ahead.
Yeah, I lowered it because I'm not sure it's the right time to ask it, and also I'm not sure how to formulate the question exactly. But
give it a go.
Yeah, it's just something, yeah, that I want to keep thinking about, especially because I'm interested, especially on the other hand, in someone like Derrida's reading of Husserl's reading of such a crisis. And I'm just a question that I have that I need to again kind of think about how to present is. How can why should one accept that at the kind of basis of the tension between like what you're setting up as sort of like a factual register and something like a lived or natural register, of course with caveats and things, would at the bottom yield something that is still substantially presentable in a positive way as opposed to like pure difference or something like that? Why would there be a character like the autonomous being that is still standing at the heart of that tension, as opposed to something that could only ever be sort of epigogically, presented?
I might be misunderstanding you, but isn't the question, in one sense, perhaps about what is gained by having this figure? And I think this is ultimately where the kind of the theme of autonomy is going to come into play, in the sense that the representation, and this is an old philosophical theme in a way, that the representation of freedom is itself a way of, in some concrete kind of determinable way, generating freedom in some sense. And I think the best way, perhaps, to kind of think about this is that there are two concepts of freedom in play. Of course, there is, on the one hand, the sort of the pure spontaneity of sort of the free will, but then there is also the concept of some kind of biological autonomy, which is more a matter of kind of a relative emancipation from the environment, so that you're either kind of physically cut off from the environment, you have your organs on the inside, and they are there is a little bit of a delay in your interactions, but also in purely descriptive terms, sort of behavioral flexibility and these things, and that sort of the idea of freedom applied to the human being in the world would then yield some kind of concrete augmentation of autonomy in this way. Does that make sense? And of course, the idea. This is sort of of what I was going to try to sort of lead up to today, with sort of the theme of autonomy. So I'm very kind of thankful for you raising this one. How about we do a round of quick kind of introductions, so I can also hear a little bit about who you are and sort of why you might be taking this seminar. And then towards the end, I've promised to set aside a little bit of time for housekeeping, in the sense of explaining assignments and sort of presentations and so on for the next sessions. But and I mean, if there are questions sort of after the round of introductions, go ahead. But I'm gonna just go through all of you in the order you appear on my screen, and I think perhaps because you asked the question first, Liam, you are first. So if you just want to say something, yeah, who you are and how you ended up here, would be super helpful.
Sure. Yeah. So my name's Niamh. I am based in Ireland. I'm registered at the New Centre. And I have a background in fine art practice. I also did a PhD in philosophy on the diagram in Deleuze and his reading of Leibniz. And more recently, I'm looking at the diagram in Châtelet. And I'm working on a particular kind of project with that, which really intersects with a lot of the kind of questions and, in this seminar. I'm working on the kind of diagram as a sort of a generative sort of mechanism to reconstruct archives and to explore them in that way. And specific to event and place. And within nesting those reconstructions within kind of science fictional narratives. And I'm really interested in a lot of things that come up here. I'm working on Simondon quite a bit, on his theory of the organism in relation to its milieu, and where he brings in, techne in this relation, and then he works across species. So it's always been on my mind about naturalism. So I'm really delighted actually that is kind of coming up here, because I really want to try and think through that. And he's putting a challenge there to the anthropocentric, and then so there is certainly a kind of naturalism and what are the implications of that. But he also has as then a way to look at sort of mechanism, machine, automaton, and also energetic system, which I think is really in relation to environment here. And energy and the kind of question of entropy. I think that seems to me to be something kind of quite important as well. So yeah, I'm delighted to be on the seminar. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Super interesting, and also sort of mispronouncing your name. That might happen to others too. I apologize in advance. And nice to meet you. And Daniel would be next to my screen. Daniel White.
There you go. You didn't mispronounce my name. Hello, everyone. My name is Dan. I live in New Jersey. This is my first seminar I'm taking with the New Center. I'm reticent to introduce myself as a food photographer, but that's kind of how it all started. I picked up the camera during the pandemic as an avid home cook, and now I'm trying to start my own practice / business where it's kind of like a hybrid between a hospitality group and a publishing arm. I'm interested in creating restaurants where they're fictitious, and so essentially I'm creating these sculptures where I'm kind of creating these beings where others consume what I'm making and they lose themselves. And so on the surface, I'm very interested in this course because I saw Lose Yourself to Space, and I'm asking others to kind of dine on these art objects and serve as a proxy to the human dining experience. I'm generally interested in a lot of world building and hyperstition, mythopoesis, and stuff like that. So this is kind of this is my first time taking a class in over a decade, so I'm just excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you too, and I mean we're going to reach the theme of eating a bit more concretely going forward. I think there's sort of going to be, once we really sort of start playing with the these sort of slightly weird analogies, and things will hopefully come together in a way that's useful for this kind of perspective too. And then I have Dylan.
Hi, yeah. I'm excited to be here. I'm in LA. I'm a PhD student in comparative literature at UC Irvine, and kind of broadly interested in deconstruction and histories of media, image, broadly construed. But over the last few years, I've been like increasingly obsessed with kind of frameworks very close to the framework of the course. Pertaining, for example, to like the rhetoricization of space and subjectivity and their relation in geographic discourses as they like develop in modernity. And then reciprocally, the way that those kinds of geographic presumptions or cognitive, for example, rhetorical presumptions about space are reproduced in other discourses such as psychoanalysis or psychology. I'm also interested in like racialization as like a kind of paradigmatic mode of differentiation of the human in modernity as well. And so kind of thinking about how that plays into the story.
Yeah, obviously, geography is a kind of a historical enterprise. It's played a huge part in sort of in modern constitution of modern racism. This is something we're going to not be talking about too much directly, unless there's kind of a interest in the room. But I think we're going to say some things specifically in the next time about this. Sort of, we'll have a little bit of bearings on sort of the engine of geography that makes this possible. This really horrific aspect of sort of that geography has become as a discipline historically. Antonio.
Hello, I'm Antonio. I'm from Brazil, but I'm based in Italy. I am an architect. I studied back in Brazil, and then I did a master's in Portugal, in Universidade do Porto, with a thesis, dissertation on architecture and chance. And lately, I have been interested in philosophy of technology and a bit of speculative realism sometimes. And I've taken this course, well, first of all, because of the title, it's very appealing. But also like, and I'm a bit sad that the discussion on autonomy is going to be only on the next class, because I think I won't be able to attend that one, but I will watch it for sure. But I'm interested in thinking about autonomy in art. And it's also a big word in art, and it has many entryways. One of them is political, which is interested, but it's not primarily what I'm interested at. I'm interested in this idea of self-reference, but also this like circular causality, or like this autopoietic unit, which is able to kind of sustain itself, and how you can think of art in this sense of as a robust being, entity, agent, whatever, that somehow exists in time, or a work of art. And yeah, still interested to see how all of that will add up, like diagonally to this interest.
Yeah, I think there's hopefully it's going to come together in a nice way. I think interesting as you kind of mentioned autopoietic systems, also because there's a way in which everything we're talking about comes down to sort of autopoiesis gone wrong in a way, and sort of a kind of a malign circularity that collapses on itself. Hopefully you can catch the recording on next time. And otherwise, we know. And then I have Rita.
Hello everyone, I'm Reda, based in Morocco. I hold some masters in geopolitics and international relations. I'm a PhD student in grand strategy and global security. I'm working currently on how the Islamic thought perceived modernity and war in the early 19th century, so the Napoleon part, etc. And yeah, I'm really interested in this seminar, first of all because of its title, and also because the enlightenment part would be with so much help. So thank you.
Thank you. And then I have Lais.
Hi everyone. My name is Lais. I'm from Brazil. I'm based in Rio right now. I'm a visual artist, but my background, my master was in geography actually, mostly focusing on dwelling and landscape and all of that. And I also, my practice lately has been related to this relationship between art and public space, and how we can display and create in an involvement with and through space. So there's that. I gotta say that the title was really catchy, because I also felt very compelled to participate in this seminar because of the title of the seminar. And then I read the summary, and it was really interesting. I think I've never read Caillois, this Mimicry and Legendary, so it's a whole new take on space for me. It's completely different from of my background. So there's another point of interest for me to try and understand this whole entanglement between the naturalist and humanist position within this context. And yeah, I guess it's that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think one of the, big challenges here is that that we're dealing with many different concepts of space at once. In a way, there are representations of space. There's some kind of physical environment, and there is also kind of outer space, and there is and so on and so forth. And within geography as a discipline, I assume that most people aren't trained in geography, there is also a huge many debates about what is actually space. We're going to be dealing with this. Next time is really when we get to the geographers that eat themselves, or supposedly. But there's a huge question about what is the role of space really in geographical explanation, and specifically when geographical thought as kind of historical discipline becomes turns towards naturalism and kind of recapitulates the problems we have been talking about today in its own regard.
Thank you very much.
And then I have Jarina.
Hi, my name is Yarina. I'm based in Canada. I'm taking this class because when I first started attending the New Center's certificate program in Worldmaking, I thought this could be part of that certificate. I was away for a few months, but I've been back since last fall. I'm also interested in phenomenology and philosophy of technology. And there's been some other classes that I've taken at the New Center that I thought I could see this class working with those. There was one on perspectivism, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, like multinaturalism and Prometheanism. So I thought I could build on that and work with that and this class. And my project is still sort of up in the air. So very happy to be in this class.
Thank you. I hope there's will be some kind of crossover between the different. I think I would suspect that this is a completely different take on similar questions, but perhaps there's some kind of line that you can manage to tease out from between the two. Then I have Marco.
Hi, I'm Marco. I'm based in Belgrade, Serbia. My background is in architecture, and currently I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Belgrade, Department of Architecture. Here at the New Center, I'm a certificate student, and my PhD research focuses on the discourse of plasticity in modern architecture. And I'm really at the beginning of the research and just have to narrow its framework and scope. But while you were talking, for example, I had in mind, recalled, for example, Herder's writings about sculpture, or plastic in German. And I was thinking about how he connects the this idea of plastic experience with the sense of space, and with the sense of touch, for example. But what he means by touch is not this palpative activity, but rather kinesthetic experience. I think this seminar will really provide me with another body of references for maybe the same problem.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's interesting though, because there are so many ways in which this same kind of tension in a way, sort of, or this kind of problem appears in different guises. And I think there is also a kind of a multi-level situation here, where sort of there is a question of kind of proprioception and the kind of kinesthetic situation of locating oneself in space, and then there are the sort of the more representational, perhaps, if one will, a higher order kind of recapitulation of a similar thing, which is what we are talking about here. Thank you. And then I have Ivan.
Hi. It's funny because Ivan is how my name is pronounced in my mother language, which is Russian, but in English I present myself as Ivan. I've been living in Tbilisi, Georgia for a while, but now I'm moving to Marseille, France. And I'm a new media artist and writer, and I've been writing about technology and art and new media from a critical perspective. And I'm drawn to this seminar because I see lots of spatial metaphors in new media theory. For instance, when you perceive an interface as a I don't know, as a factory of a source or something like this, or they talk about porous media and kind of mixing up the architecture and urbanism and media theory. And yeah, and of course I use those spatial metaphors too, and I would like to go further and see where does it come from, and where the space ends and the time starts, things like this. So like learning it. Sorry, it's too late in my time zone. Yeah, so that's it. Yeah.
Thank you. No, it does make sense. I promise you. And it's. I think the sort of the question of time is something that's probably not going to enter so strongly here, but rather sort of the removal of time is almost like the premise of this seminar. So it's I think it's also something that I'm working through, sort of how to map onto kind of temporality into this entire thing. So if you come up with anything, we can talk about it. And then I have Georgiana.
Oh, hi. Hello, everyone. I'm Georgiana. I'm originally from Romania, but I live now in Germany. So the reason I took this seminar were twofold. My background is in literature. Literature has to deal with space. And writing characters that relate to that space. And then Caillois, I think his method that you outlined in the first 2 slides, in which he throws this net, and it's important that there is a net in the first place, because it's not a free speculation. Or making taxonomies necessarily in this like unlimited freedom of so on. That in literature, if you allow it, ends up in failure because you don't manage to form something. And therefore, this notion of form, of morphic emancipation, if you like, is also something that I'm privately exploring. And how this emancipation ultimately is tied to something that is endured and channeled in both free yet somehow organized, oriented, even temporarily so, concepts. And I think we, in the seminar description, the word that caught my attention was naturalism, and coming from literature, this has a different understanding. And I remember that when I was during my bachelor studies, this was an obsession of mine. I was always fascinated why naturalists such as Maupassant, for example, who was an extremist in that sense, he said in Le Roman, the novel, like, I want to write the history of the heart, the soul, and the mind in their normal state. And he was, of course, influenced by what was going on in biology and all these sorts of deterministic, if you like, explanations of emotion, of heredity, information, and so on. But somehow for them, it was impossible not to infuse even these like naturalistic accounts with psychological insight that then collapsed into the supernatural or into symbolism or into speculation of an esoteric, of an almost esoteric quality. So yeah, I think I'm not sure if I make sense here. I think the problem I have with Caillois is that yes, how to avoid the pseudo stuff. Like you put there the risks of this method, and I would say that the project to link literary inquiry or writing literature to science is ongoing, and yeah, I think literature has to not necessarily catch up with it, but look at itself, rediscover itself as something that it already achieved before to do many times. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I think you bring up a few points to see someone in terms of the method, which is maybe for me one of the most important ones. It's also a matter of certainly making connections and being kind of strategically, I wouldn't say ambiguous, but sort of maybe being a tiny bit strategically lazy with trying to define things and then sort of going backwards and doing it when prodded in a way. Of course, methodology is both a kind of a very big and a very sort of overlooked question in philosophy. I would dare to say that sort of every philosopher has an idea of what they're doing, but there is very sort of a limited, perhaps, discussion about what is actually or kind of at least consensus in terms of what constitutes sound methodology, especially in a very practical sense. I would say though, just this is a good opportunity to say that to the extent to which we sort of bring this sort of methodological aspect of the seminar into view is largely a kind of a consequence of sort of what questions kind of arise as we go. There's a way in which this turns into kind of a meta level, and we talk about how to draw this line between different seemingly similar natural phenomena. And there's one world in which we kind of mostly focus on sort of the horror story, as it might be, of geography eating itself. Next, I have Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a freelance classical musician in the US. Also have a philosophy degree. I guess kind of non-professional or as a dilettante, I'm a little bit interested in the possibility of, or the role and possibility of critique in a utopian end state, or what is required to sustain utopia at the end of history if it comes. So yeah, I think this is obviously related to that. That's why I'm taking the seminar.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hopefully, this kind of epistemological kind of angle that we're pursuing here is useful to this too. This is something that I'm sort of unsure about myself also. That sort of what is actually the eventual cash out of this kind of narrative. So in this way, I'm quite looking forward to what you. Hopefully, you find something that is meaningful to this end. Joshua.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. Hi. So my name's Joshua. I'm originally from Berlin, Germany, currently based in Zurich, and I'm an architect. As an architect, I'm part of a collective called Architecture Land Initiative. We're based in Zurich and Geneva, and we work kind of at the intersection of architecture and territorial transformation. I also teach at the ETH in Zurich in a speculative design studio. And I'm also in the process, I would say, which is part of the reason I'm at the new center. I'm in the process of finding ways of expanding my practice of spatial strategy and spatial thinking to problems outside of the traditional discipline of architecture and urbanism. And in general, I'm really interested in how different conceptions of space kind of influence the objectives and the values of spatial design. Which is why I'm also interested in how other disciplines outside of architecture think about space and theorize space. And oftentimes I feel like they're way ahead of how architects think about space. So for instance, geography, but also the sciences and obviously philosophy. And yeah, right now I'm particularly interested in how notions of the planetary imply a new understanding of space as sort of radically relational, where certain oppositions are dissolved between inside, outside, local, global, discrete and continuous, and so on, and how this kind of dissolution also questions the autonomy of the human by extension. And yeah, I'm interested in how basically how to figure space in this new planetary era and what that means for design at large, what design even still is under these new circumstances somehow. Yeah, that's basically what it is. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's interestingly, hopefully there's something that sort of comes across in all of this that is also applicable to the question of the planetary and this sort of the specific arrangement or kind of rearrangement of scales in which it sort of ends up situating the human being. Of course, there's this kind of perspectival construal of sort of a new view of the human, but I think there's also in a way a new meaning of what being human is in this kind of causal situation that sort of the Anthropocene discourses brought out. So yeah, hopefully that will yield something. And then I have Andre.
Hi, I'm an architect as well. I'm about to. Can you hear me actually? Because
yes.
I think maybe I need to change the mic. Okay, so I'm also an architect, also based in Switzerland. Actually, no, Joshua. I'm about to finish my master's at ETH in Zurich, and I could like relate a lot that Joshua just said. I guess like we're kind of reading similar books. But I guess I have a very broad interest in space, and also before studying architecture, I think there was sort of a spatial kind of surrealist desire of like working with space, thinking spatially, reading about it. Yeah, kind of almost like meditative, neuro, psychological, cognitive science kind of threads that lured me into architecture, and I couldn't really find what I wanted. I couldn't really find it there, and I guess my current aim is to also kind of find paths to develop a practice that is not very limited to categories. So in a sense, like I do have an artistic practice, but I'm very much interested in new infrastructures, which can also be digital, which can be the kind of practical solutions to the problems that we talk about, or the kind of planetary understandings, so the little pieces. I think I'm interested in engineering kind of these things, whatever this is, and this is very hard to define. So I guess I'm looking for little vehicles here in this seminar. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe techniques for conceptual navigation of the human being or something like that. I think there's also, of course, the theme of so here something brought it to mind when you were talking, and sort of what kind of spatiality is involved in actually the thinking about space. And that is something that we're going to come back to, because of course all these sort of spatial disciplines with geography or architecture or certain kinds of philosophy are involved in some kind of thinking about space. But presumably there is also some kind of spatiality in the space enacted, or relationship to space enacted in what they do. And I think that is maybe ultimately what we're talking about in this seminar. Then I have Emme.
Hello, can you hear
Hello.
me? Yeah. Hello, everyone. Hello, Carl. I'm Emme from Medellin, Colombia. I'm a musician and songwriter. I have a background in philosophy, and I'm doing currently a master's degree in Latin American cultural studies. And I am particularly interested in sonic theory and sonic materialism, and my research goes around specifically around Latin American sonic fiction, and specifically also Medellin's sonic fiction, and how the idea of Medellin is actually shaped through sound, through audiovisual kind of images. And I am very into these kind of ideas of place, ideas of the city, and I have been like going through the foundation of the city, which is very colonial, and how the city has been transformed with different factors like violence or drug or political craziness, and how all this has been shaping the actual space, but also how sound plays a role in that, how from pop music to listening as such, you know, like the listener, the position of the listener, what is the space that is developed through listening. And there is also this question about naturalism in terms of sound, because sound has been kind of put in the background sometimes, or like a second object, or something like derived from a previous nature that is not sonic, and how there are other theories in which sound is actually an element and a generative force, or has a big potential for in this case space, but this means a lot of things, you know, like from a listening perspective. So yeah, I'm very interested to see how sonic theory can dialogue with all these references and your classes. Thank you.
Cheers. I think definitely I think it's the question of autonomy that's going to be kind of the clear interface of that kind of different sensory modalities. I suspect. Nicholas.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I am Nicholas. I am a philosopher based in Bogota, in Colombia, as Emme. This is my first seminar here at the New Center. I'm enrolled in the critical philosophy program. I hold a master's degree in philosophy, and my dissertation was on the importance of pessimism to thinking our current environmental catastrophe. and especially going through some concepts like apocalypse, catastrophe, collapse, trying to tell why those kind of approaches to climate change have some potential, and also trying to trace back in some background in the history of modernity in America, like going through those concepts in the history of modernity in America. How can that enlighten some ways to respond? I think that this class has some relations with some concepts and discussions I'm interested in, especially the distinction between the alive, the dead, and something of other status that is neither alive nor dead. In Elizabeth Spinelli's concept, the chaos, in her geontologies. And I think that that has some insightful ideas to think about the way we're thinking autonomy, at least in this first round of readings.
Yes, thank you. That's an interesting take. I've been thinking through, trying to think through the relationship between sort of life and death in connection to this, and sort of whether or not it's kind of mappable onto it. I think in one world it would be very easy to say that sort of there's something morbid in kind of returning to space in this way, but I think also this is maybe too easy. I sort of, it's something I'm keeping. I'm also trying, really sort of puzzled by, because of autonomy, of course, sort of being not autonomous or having low autonomy in this biological sense, of course, not being dead in any way, because it would be strange to kind of include this kind of weird hierarchy or sort of within life. So it's, but at the same time, there's something intuitive that sort of that suggests that sort of, okay, a return into space would be some kind of dying, also kind of echoes of Freud and the death drive there. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I think we have about, 7 more people. We have about 15 minutes left of the seminar. So let's go through everyone. I need a few minutes to sort of talk through the assignments at the end. But essentially, let's take our time with this, and then sort of we'll just run over for a few minutes. If someone has to run, that's okay, and I'll just post the information about the assignments in the Discord channel afterwards, and also by email. Next, I have Parsa.
Hello, everyone. I'm Parsa, a multimedia artist and sound designer from Iran. My main interests are speculative realism and post-humanism. And I'm currently working on a sonic fiction project for Kenji Siratori's latest project called Xenopoem. And actually, the title was really appealing. That was one of my reasons. And the concepts of autonomy and space was interesting for me, and the relation of sound and space and soundscapes and all of that was interesting to me. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, as I said, I think there's a question of the different sensory modalities that is going to kind of map into this also when we start talking about autonomy and sort of finding our bearings in the environment. Then I have Jasan. Oh, sorry. I can read it for you if you want. So hello everyone, I'm a bit sick, so I will quickly introduce myself here. My name is Jasan, a student in the critical philosophy program. I'm from Jordan, but based in New York. I have a BSc in information technology and an MA in publishing and journalism. I'm a writer, editor, and translator, and I'm interested in the philosophy and politics of technology, subjectivity and universality, and contemporary art, among other things, and hoping that taking this seminar would inform my research and writing. I hope that True, and I hope you feel better soon, Yasan. And then I have Marina.
Hi everyone, I'm Marina. I'm a new media artist currently based in Georgia, DC. I would say currently I'm interested in the agency of memory, kind of like embodied practices transmitting knowledge and the potential for creating digital environments for resistance and healing, but also in the problematic of processing collective trauma online and like the porous self and in general like digital environment as a way of thinking and cognitive landscape and the questions of agency and reinterpretations of alienation, stuff like that. That's all.
Thank you. I could hear you a little bit poorly, but I think I got most of the meaning. I think there's also the question of kind of again, sort of the cash out of all this in terms of urgency. Of course, there are many things that are kind of are being played out in sort of how this problematic, this kind of tension between different images of the human being is playing out. That has quite, I mean, arguably very severe. Arguably, it's the entire problematic of modernity, and sort of the urgency of this is clearly multifaceted. So in this regard, I think there's hopefully some sort of kind of orthogonal lines that can be drawn from what we're doing here that can kind of inform some other sort of perspectives. Then I have Andrew.
Hello. So basically, currently, I'm less of a participant and more of an attendee. So for the most part, I'm just going to be sitting by the sidelines and trying to follow the line of argument simply because I find it interesting and want to see how much of it I can understand. For context, at this exact moment, I'm oscillating somewhere between a critic of any possible medium I can get my head wrapped around and poet, whether that be through poetry or something more novel length remains to be seen. And yeah, while I haven't exactly had much of a motive before, just curiosity of encountering this. For one, my current exile in Arizona has definitely brought up some tensions in regards to environment and how it can inform / inhibit one's capacity for doing things, both in the blasted landscape of it, but also this tension with a bounty, if somewhat fragile bounty of weird flora and fauna that's out here. And also some of my other colleagues have been expressing some concerns with the seeming lack of imagination in things like the housing crisis in the face of climate change. For instance, one thing that they suggested was perhaps a change from a sort of sedentary tract housing format to something more nomadic, like a mobile housing sort of thing. So while this isn't directly related, it does feel like an interesting philosophical parallel or even possible background to these problems that have been in the background of circles I've been in for the past couple of years. So look forward to see how much I can follow through.
I would say that hopefully this was the most kind of information dense session. So I would say that probably it's going to not be a problem. I do think background is probably the right word, because insofar as we're really trying to think about geography as its own kind of, the knowledge of space in a way as its own kind of spatial practice. And hopefully there will be sort of some things that can be picked out from that. And then I have Agatha.
Hi, I'm also an attendee. and I'm a visual artist, and I also do public art projects. And I'm based in Poland. Currently, I work at the Fine Arts Academy in Katowice, where I teach painting and public art. And I will try to grasp as much knowledge as I can here and probably use it for some artistic purpose, but I don't know how yet. So thank you, Carl, for this lecture. It was really nice.
Thank you. Hopefully there's something that comes out of it for you. And then I have Pichaya.
Hello, hi. I'm a curator. Currently, I'm in Singapore, but I'm based in Bangkok. I have a background in museum planning and design that I worked in the US. And then I came back home to Thailand for a job as a curator in an art center. Currently, I'm working on this research that I worked on for a long time. It's about critical spatial literacy in techno-organic environments. And I'm interested in how distributed cognition and material agency could kind of shape this new way of thinking about knowledge creation in space. Maybe I've worked a lot with interpretive space for museums, and I feel like space has always been in the background. So I'm hoping that the rest of my career I could put the space as a forefront, to be at the center stage, and trying to work on the curatorial framework to do that. So thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, certainly we're bringing space into the foreground in order to. I think at the end of the day, ultimately, this is another way just another way to think about what we're doing here. It's a question of foreground and kind of background relationships. So, I mean, already the notion that you kind of bring up, that sort of bringing space into the foreground, is already a kind of a spatial idea, kind of embedded in that, in a way that background and foreground are intrinsically sort of spatial concepts. That's quite interesting. And last but not least, I think I may have forgotten someone, but in that case, you have to speak up. I have Sarush.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't know if you can hear me because my internet connection is so bad, but can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay, my name is Sarush. I got my PhD in philosophy a few years ago. I worked on Deleuze and Heidegger, and who both are, like, in some sense, fascinated with the idea of space, as you know. And I'm working on a project where I want to somehow understand what space means in a broader sense, as if we could include like a kind of something which I call a xenospace, which is the name of a game I'm designing in my novel. And I'm interested in seeing how we could develop a more and more abstract concept of space, which could include like even a logical space and also like cosmos as a whole. I don't know if it would make sense in the end, but I'm interested in going through this path. And I guess like it is connected to the idea of abstraction and intelligence in a broad sense, like in what Negarstani speaks about in intelligence and spirit. So I was fascinated by the lecture today, because I had previously had taken part in one of your lectures, where you talked about space and geography and I like the way you actually deterritorialize the concepts and go through different angles. So I guess this is very interesting to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's also very helpful to hear. I think that I was going to say something on the just as a final point here to the question of. No, sorry, I completely lost what I was going to say, but it had to do with abstraction and sort of trying to find a different perspectives.
Yeah.
It will come back.
Maybe next time.
Maybe next time. Now, I'm going to operate under the assumption that nobody has been forgotten. If someone has been forgotten, now would be the time to shout or raise your hand or something. And because I'm going to leave you all with, before we go into for a few minutes, a kind of a description of the assignments and the new center crediting system and sort of what we need to do. I'm going to create a tiny bit of informal homework. And this homework is going to take the form of a question. And this question is quite simple. The question is, what is geography? And as we sort of go into next week, I think it's worth kind of reflecting on this a little bit. I would just like to also quickly, so next week we're going to continue the theme of sort of go from Caillois into autonomy, and then we're going to talk about Kant's lecture on physical geography. I would just mention here that sort of it's the introduction that we're reading, and that what follows the introduction is quite unpalatable and mostly kind of a good case study of kind of the horror that geography can take. What we're interested in is kind of philosophical idea of what geography is, and not really about Kant's geographical thought per se, or sort of his ideas about the world. And then we have another couple of texts that are coming from British cultural geography that we're going to argue kind of implement this kind of problematic naturalism. So, well, I wouldn't say answer the question so much as just think about it in some way, maybe worth keeping in mind. So essentially, the new center kind of suggests or mandates that we do sort of student presentations in relation to the readings. That would be like 5 minutes. I think we're going to do a few of them since there are quite a few of us. And this mostly pertains to you if you're taking this class for kind of a credit and or in respect for the certificate program, or if you would like to just do it for fun, maybe a 5-minute presentation that in connection to one of the texts. I think traditionally the idea is to kind of summarize and present the text. I would say that we're going to have a sign-up sheet that Jenny will link. But if you sign up in relation to the text, maybe we'll have to have 2 or 3 people per text, and then sort of if you organize it as to do it together, or if you each want to do one thing yourself, that's kind of up to you. In any case, we're going to basically have time in class for 3 presentations total. But there's also the opportunity to just sort of record them and send them directly to me, or sort of, and I will watch them and kind of comment. In terms of what the actual assignment is, choose a text, I would say, and do something and talk about it for a few minutes, and do it in a way that seems useful and interesting to you, whether that's a summary or sort of something that seemed, or if you just bring out some points that seemed interesting to you, or if you take it in a completely different direction and write a musical piece about it, that's also fine. I would say that this is basically going to be it. At the end of the seminar, there's going to be a kind of the chance to kind of submit a slightly longer piece of work as an essay or such, but I'm going to come back to that maybe next time or toward the end, since we're a bit short on time and this isn't really going to be too relevant. But but essentially, you will get the opportunity to submit something, and I will comment to it on it, and you will receive it back. And aside from that, is there anything I've forgotten, Jenny? What do you think?
I don't think so. I think the easiest way for everyone to access everything is just through the Google folder that Carl already linked to in the Discord. Also, I can send it out by email afterwards, but all of the relevant documents, including the presentation sign-up sheet, are in there. Just to clarify, you can submit a recorded presentation instead of like doing a live presentation in class, and the recorded ones and the live ones are both due at the start of the session that they correspond to. So if you look at the spreadsheet, it's pretty clear. But if you need any, if you have any concerns or confused about it, you can just reach out to me. And I guess I'll just put my email here in case you just have like technical or admin or non-substantive questions about the class.
Yeah, and you can also write to me. If I would say also that I'm going to get you 1 second, Antonio, but if you have sort of access to the Discord server of New Center, that's a good idea, because I'm going to put things there because I find it easy and convenient. Yeah, essentially, that would be probably either by email or the Discord. That would be my kind of preferred way of communication. Okay, Antonio.
Just a quick question. Since we can do recorded presentations, I don't know if it would make sense, but could I make a presentation of a text that was assigned for this class?
Yes.
So it would be already late, but
yeah, I would say that sort of if you want to do it for the next class, I would basically lump together the ones for this class and since for the next one. So feel free to do that. I honestly sort of make something that's useful for you, and we'll go from there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, right now the way that the texts are lined up per session are the ones that are assigned in the syllabus for that particular class. So that's just the easiest way to, lay it out and have the live in-class presentations. For the recorded ones, you can just kind of choose whatever text you want. And yeah, if you have problems filling out the sheet, again, you can just email me.
Yeah, any final questions? Either technical or kind of substantive? In terms of being on the topic of geographers that end up eating themselves.
Oh, sorry, one last thing about the presentations. I think the newsletter wants to encourage people to work in groups. So I have like all of the presenters for 1 week grouped for each text. If you're the only name there, obviously you're presenting alone, but if there are more than 2 people, you can consider working together. If 2 people really want to work separately, again, you can reach out to me. But anyways, you're encouraged to work in groups. And even if you're in a group, the total presentation still only needs to be 10 minutes, so that you could also divide up the work that way a lot easier. But I think that's the last thing about presentations.
Excellent, thank you. And also thank you for helping to moderate this, Jenny. It's very useful. And finally, thank you to everyone for listening. I will say that hopefully I was a little bit nervous today, so hopefully things will be a little bit calmer the next few sessions, and we're going to slowly sort of dig ourselves down into sort of and try to undermine the entire process of enlightenment and see how that corresponds to geographers that end up eating themselves all up. Nice to meet you all, and see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.